want to maximize our time together today. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, our conversation will be recorded so we can share it with our community at a later date. So to quickly introduce myself, I'm Lauren. I'm the managing director of Stop Stalking Us, which was founded by Lily Baldwin after she went public with her story of being stalked by somebody she doesn't know, which has been going on for 14 years and counting. We're the only nonprofit NGO in the US that focuses exclusively on those who've been impacted by stalking. And we work to build awareness, provide a platform where people can share their stories. We curate resources, and we are building a strong and supportive community. So this January marks the 20th annual National Stalking Awareness Month. And last year, we ended our speaker series talking about mental health and the long-term impacts of being stalked and the trauma that comes with that. But this year, we wanted to have that conversation first, knowing that while this month can be really meaningful to our community, it can also be really difficult for those at the center of this crime, whether they identify as victims or survivors, as well as activists. And in addition to building our community, we want to continue providing a range of tools, knowing that there are no quick or easy solutions to this kind of complex trauma. So we're very lucky today to have Michelle C. Johnson with us, who has a wide range of experience as an author, activist, spiritual teacher and practitioner, racial equity consultant and trainer, and intuitive healer. So Michelle, before we dive into everything, I just want to set the stage and give a little context for today's conversation. Anybody who's been stalked or seen it firsthand know that it's a unique experience that's hard to describe. It's an extremely violent crime, although in most cases there will never be visible blood or wounds. It's a repetitive crime that often happens over long periods of time. That sometimes might be a few months or a year. And then there's situations like Lily, which are not uncommon, where it goes on for a decade or two or more. It's often diminished, romanticized, misunderstood, and there's often little to no recourse available. So for those who are lucky enough to be able to pursue a legal case, they often feel more victimized by the process of our patchwork, inequitable legal system. And this abuse often happens on an unpredictable schedule. A victim may not hear from their stalker for months, and then out of the blue, they'll be bombarded. And those interactions can swing wildly from confessions of love and gifts and flowers to deep hate and physical threats all at the same time. It's been described by researcher Dr. Patrick Brady as psychological torture, which means stalking victims have the extremely difficult, exhausting task of trying to navigate all of the elements of their lives while they're under attack or while that threat looms really loudly over them. So they have to balance the impact of having to be hypervigilant with the really very real need to be alert to their surroundings. So that is sort of the context for which we're gonna, and the lens through which we're gonna have our conversation today. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us. I know we could spend the full hour just talking about you and your incredible bio, but I'd love if you could share with our audience a little bit more about you and your work and how you came to it.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to be here, and for those who were here and watching the recording, and for the work that you all do. As Lauren shared, my name is Michelle. My pronouns are she and her, and to locate myself geographically, I live on the ancestral land of the Catawba, the Cherokee, the Tutelo, the Saponi, the Occaneechi, and many other tribes in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. As Lauren mentioned, I do many things, and one of which is I'm an author, and I imagine what we'll talk about is some of my work around grief and also around healing. I was a licensed clinical social, well, I'm still a licensed clinical social worker and have been for a long time. I'm not practicing in that way right now, but was practicing as an LCSW for 20 years. And worked with many folks who had experienced trauma, all different types of trauma, And I do a lot of intuitive healing work individually and within groups at this time as well. And I've been a dismantling racism trainer and racial equity educator for many years. And I also want to mention, given our conversation and the work that you all do, that I worked at the Orange County Rape Crisis Center in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for many years on staff, but prior to that as a volunteer, and prior to that as someone who received services from the OCRCC. So while it may not be the same as stalking, we certainly worked with clients in that context who were experiencing stalking, and sexual violence and intimate partner violence and stalking are violent crimes and experiences, as you spoke about. So there's more, but that's a little bit about who I am and what I do and how I came to this kind of work. I should sort of centralize the theme of my work, which is healing, both individually and collectively. And I don't see a separation between the individual and the collective, although we may be having experiences that are quite different from one another. There's also this cultural experience of trauma that I'm sitting with and responding to most of the time. And so how I came to healing work, I think, is through my own questions about imbalance in the world, about violence in the world, about disconnection and separation. And then my own individual experiences of trauma, which range, from this experience of being in a Black body in this culture. And when I say culture, I located myself, I live in the US, I've grown up in the US, this is where I've been. And in my experience, Blackness is not valued or appreciated. So that's informed my healing work. I'm a cisgender woman and I live in a patriarchal culture, right? And where systems of dominance exist, which is certainly connected to what we are talking about today and why we're here. And that to me links to the disconnection that I noticed as a young child and a curiosity about why there was disconnection and separation. And so a lot of my healing work is in response to dominant narratives and systems and how to disrupt them. And so I came to that work through this experience of being in this body with the various identities I embody, but also because I was curious about what was up and what was happening and what my role, I would say as an adult, what my role is in response to these systems that cause harm. And the final thing I'll say about how I came to my work is, and my practice, I don't always think about it as work, is that I'm deeply concerned about humanity and concerned about the planet. And I am in some ways confused about what's going on, and in other ways can point to like how systems have been designed. And I'm thinking about what you named about the in quotes justice system, right? And how survivors have to navigate that system and often are victimized over and over and over when they're trying to heal from trauma. And so I'm confused, and I'm also like, oh, this is how systems work. This is how they were designed. And I feel like that is rooted in why I do what I do, because I'm quite heartbroken about the state of things. And I feel like there are so many ways that, myself included in this because I'm implicated in these systems, that we are incentivized to move away from the truth of who we are. And if we continue to move away from the truth of who we are instead of coming into wholeness, I think we know what will happen, right? It's like there's evidence all around polarization and divisiveness and separation and harm and violence and the carceral system and all of these different things that are not about coming back into wholeness. So the other piece of why I do what I do is because I feel deeply heartbroken about what is going on. And I feel like that heartbreak is, and the grief connected to it, is part of what allows me to continue to actually practice. And the grief and heartbreak call me into action. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Well, thank you so much for naming that. And I know there's sometimes an instinct or a want for people to, put a positive spin, or where's the hope, and that can exist at the same time. But I think, being able to name the grief and the crises around us is also so important. So thank you for for naming that. I'm curious, I would imagine that in your work over these many years that you've seen or experienced also an uptick in people talking about trauma, or understanding what had happened to them previously as trauma. Um, uh, and yeah, which I think is overall like a good thing, but I think it also means there's kind of a lot of noise and a lot of things that get lumped together or conflated, or uh capitalistic society that's like, oh, here, we'll sell you things to deal with your trauma. So can you talk a little bit more just about your approach to complex forms of trauma and what the impact is on the body, sort of, physically, mentally, emotionally, especially when you have the elements of stalking, and that type of violence that I mentioned earlier, things that are ongoing and repeated, unpredictable over a long period of time.
Yeah, and in preparation for our conversation, I was thinking some about this, and so I will speak to what I call the self system, and you just named the different parts of that. And I also want to begin by responding to what you said about the capitalist system, which of course is connected to other systems of harm and dominance, and this idea that we are told that we're not enough, that we're broken, that we must buy things to be fulfilled, to be better, to be enough. And often those kind of things do not actually make us feel whole. And the system knows that. And yet there are messages everywhere about what we need to do to care for ourselves and how we do it. And it's really not in the name of care. So you just feel like you just named that, which is important. And I also feel like when I think about trauma, as I named, I think about the collective trauma, the cultural trauma that's just in the air that we're experiencing differently, but each one of us is experiencing in some way. And an example of this is whether or not people are in touch with it. The climate's in crisis right now, and there is a thing called climate chaos, right? And climate change can be felt in the body if we are able to tune in. And there are things that get in the way, including trauma, of us connecting to our bodies. I'm well aware of that, but I'm sort of giving this example of like in the actual air, there is this presence of chaos that is persistent. And certainly we influence as humans, that's affecting the planet we live on, and will of course affect future generations, and will affect those who are already most marginalized. And so that's one example. There are other examples, but I wanted to sort of give that level. And whether or not we're aware of it, it's affecting our nervous systems, it's affecting our bodies, it's affecting our geography, it's affecting the ecosystem. There's that. There's also intergenerational trauma, which I would say isn't separate from what I just named, actually, but intergenerational trauma being passed on from one generation to the next, housed in our DNA. And there's been a ton of research about that and how we pass on trauma. I'll also name, and it's likely we'll talk about this later, that we can pass on resilience as well, and our healing traditions as well. So I just want to balance that out. We are passing on trauma, and we're also passing on other things that might support us in disrupting this continuation of trauma. And there's more about intergenerational trauma, but I would say housed in all of our bodies, we have this experience of trauma, and it means that we might react to certain situations in ways that don't make sense to us. This, of course, can happen with PTSD as well, from an experience of trauma once, an individual trauma or complex trauma, or trauma that happens over and over and over, that's repetitive, which you named when you shared about stalking, that often it's this repetitive pattern that occurs, and sometimes there's no contact, and then there's a lot of contact and no contact, which you name puts the nervous system in this state of hypervigilance, and it doesn't allow the system to the nervous system to find a state of homeostasis. And when I think about what I was naming about individual and complex trauma, which of course it's a pattern, and so we know it's not just happening to one individual, it's happening to many individuals, but the nature of it or the flavor of it or how it feels might be different to someone. I often think about this kind of trauma, stalking, sexual violence, abuse, things like this, that certainly can go on and on, right? and can happen multiple times in one's life, that the first experience of this kind of trauma disrupts the nervous system and throws us off balance, is often how I describe it. And as I know from my work as a clinical social worker, part of what the nervous system does somatically is it's going to try to move us back into balance. But often what it does is replays the trauma over and over to try to get us back into balance, which sounds like counterintuitive, that that's what the system would do, but it's also trying to work it out. It's like trying to work it out with a different response to bring the nervous system back into homeostasis. And people can be, and I've had this experience, like they can be stuck in this place of the nervous system replaying the trauma over and over, which doesn't allow them to find that balanced state anymore. And I just named all three of those: this cultural trauma, intergenerational trauma, which cultural trauma changes our consciousness, shifts how we are as beings and as groups of people, this intergenerational trauma, and then a trauma one might experience in their life once or multiple times. And obviously many people are experiencing it. That all three of these traumas are happening. And so you all might be working with survivors who are experiencing stalking or have experienced it while they're humans on the planet and climate chaos is going on, while housed in their body there is intergenerational trauma and DNA, and folks are trying to figure out, why am I responding this way? And I just name this because they can all three, and there are actually other types of trauma too, but the three I named can sort of get tangled, I feel like, in this web that feels really hard to, it can feel difficult to sort of decipher what is the nature of this trauma when they're all interconnected. So I wanted to name that. And one way that I think about responding to all three forms of trauma that I named, this sort of trauma one might experience in their lives that may be different than someone else, the intergenerational trauma and the cultural trauma, is to work with the system called the self system. And the self system was presented to me or shared with me from one of my colleagues, Vivette Jeffries-Logan, who at the time was working at in an organization who was working with survivors of intimate partner violence. And so Vivette had this lens and frame when she brought this model to us. We were in a racial equity collective training group. And the self system has four different parts, which you named: the mental, the mind, the spirit, however people think of spirit, the physical body, and the emotional landscape, or the emotions that move through us. One might have different words to describe who they are, the different parts of who they are. And I found that this model is really helpful to be thinking about the physical part of the soma, or the body, or the system, the mental part, the spiritual part, the emotional part. And we can think about this as an individual, like I have all four parts of those things. I'm in a physical body, I have different emotions moving through, I have different thought patterns or mental states or ways that my mind might operate. Which can be connected to certainly DNA and what's been passed along, and trauma. So physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, all of those things are alive in me now. And groups of people, communities, also have a system that operates similarly, and culture does as well. And so it relates to the three different kinds of trauma that I was discussing. And something to know about this self system is that when one part is out of balance, the whole system's out of balance. So if I think about the work that you all do, some people may experience physical responses to the trauma. I'm not talking about physical harm, although that could happen, but some people may experience, right, I'm nauseous, I'm sick, I don't feel connected to my body, I am having heart palpitations, right? These things can be connected to emotions and the mind as well, and anxiety that can emerge in PTSD for sure, but they may show up with like a physical manifestation in response to the trauma. They may experience trouble concentrating or focusing, or listlessness, or depression, or, as I named, post-traumatic stress disorder, or something similar to that in response to their trauma, where there's hypervigilance, the nervous system is on alert all of the time, that it can be difficult to sleep, in response to this, which of course affects the physical body, right? And the emotions that go along with this, where one can feel sad, one can feel confused, one can feel unsure, and lack a belief in themselves, right? Confidence. One can experience a lot of self-doubt as well. And this to me also connects to the spiritual part. Again, however people think of spirit, sometimes it's a connection to something bigger, sometimes it's what's bigger than the body, sometimes it's energy moving through the body, that people can feel a disconnection to that spiritual part of themselves, or whatever word they might use to describe spirit. And so when I'm working with people, and I just assume everyone's experienced trauma in some way, even if it's not the same as the work that you all do, but to some degree for humans alive on the planet, we're feeling something. And then there are very specific examples of trauma that are happening to people all of the time that people are living with and responding to. And when I work with people, I'm assuming, okay, I'm working with trauma in some way. I'm working with their response to some event that moved them away from center or off balance, or made them feel fragmented or fractured. And I'm looking at, in conversation with someone, of course, I'm not pathologizing or like assessing in this context, but I'm looking for, where is there an imbalance physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually? How is this showing up in one's life? And then what is the response to that? How do we heal those different parts so that the system can be in balance and find that state of homeostasis, which I would say is actually quite difficult given all that's going on our planet right now, and how pervasive the trauma and a response to trauma, such as stalking, right? Responding to that, how pervasive that is, right? It can take over someone's life because of the hypervigilance and not knowing, right? What's going to happen next? So I'm like talking about homeostasis as if it's a thing that we can experience. And I do think there's certain moments where I like feel it for a moment. And I want to acknowledge that it's quite difficult to find that state of balance in response to trauma, and all the different types of trauma that I was speaking about. So that's a little about the self system in a way that someone might begin to ask, okay, what's going on physically? How do I feel, right? Let me check in emotionally. What's on my emotional landscape? Am I having trouble focusing or concentrating? Or do I feel foggy, right? Or do I feel disconnected from community or friends or family, given or chosen? Or do I feel just like I'm moving through space, I'm untethered, I'm not connected to anything? These are some questions people can begin to ask themselves to start to understand, how have I been affected by this trauma? Which then can point to, what do I need to do to resource myself? Which we can talk more about. But that was a long answer to your question.
No, I mean, that was all great. And I think the other kind of trauma, and I don't know how, I know all of your work, it sounds very integral, is vicarious trauma, which is something that I didn't understand. And that was how I came into stalking and didn't have words for it. And so that's something too, that as we look to support victims and survivors of stalking, of also being able to support the people in their families who want to help and don't know how, or who are also on that kind of parallel roller coaster and just live in fear for somebody who they love and don't know how to help. And so that's something else that is important to us, as a way of supporting survivors, is supporting the people in their lives too that are also impacted by it. But I know everything you said is still relevant to that form as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you named that, because it is something that when I worked at the Rape Crisis Center, that we talked a lot about, had support groups for secondary survivors. And to your point, for people, service providers, or for family and friends, in our clients' lives, so that they can have resources, because sometimes in that experience of vicarious trauma, someone's having these responses to the trauma that they didn't directly experience. And so they're trying to make sense of that, and also don't have control over what happens. right? Which I feel like it's just very ungrounding to have that experience. And so definitely having resources for folks who are experiencing vicarious trauma or secondary survivors or family and friends feels very important because, there was a time, I've been a social worker for a long time, when people weren't talking about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma as much as they are now, or burnout even, right? Like, or these things that happen when we're in this field of work or body of work. And I feel like for a long time, people didn't know what was happening to them, right? Why do I feel this way? Why can't I sleep? Why am I having nightmares? The folks who had not directly experienced it or had done some healing and then were a service provider, like trying to figure out. I remember when I was working at the Rape Crisis Center, although I am a survivor, I had done a lot of healing work. And when I was working there, I read all of the client paperwork. I had, as my job, I had to read the client paperwork and make sure things were responded to. And all of a sudden, I started checking my locks in my house more and more. And I was like, oh, you're reading about on a flat piece of paper. It wasn't the computer, it was like paper, it was blue paper. You're reading about these experiences and how many people have called the crisis line and who went to the hospital. And I was like, you're checking the locks because this is like, you're thinking about this all of the time, and it shifted your perspective and view. And so I'm glad you named it, because I wanted to, it's important to sort of normalize that response, because it can be so confusing, or to try to understand what's going on with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, you talked a little bit about resourcing, and, I know that's, again, would be certainly more than an hour long, definitely more than, an Instagram carousel of bullet points. But when you're working or doing trainings, what are some examples of resourcing or how people might approach that?
Yeah, it's a big topic. And when I say resourcing, I mean, how do we come back into balance or attempt to, or how do we care for ourselves in a moment? And what can we practice? And I want to name that some of the practices that I might share or talk about in this resourcing section, they may feel like they actually are not a response to what someone's been through. And so I know that, like, inviting someone to breathe when they're like, I haven't consciously breathed in forever, right? Like, it can feel like this mismatch. And yet I know the nervous system is what needs to be tended to somatically when there's been a disruption. So I sort of want to frame what I'm about to say with that. And often what I share with people is our contemplative or mindfulness practices to come back to oneself. That might be a movement practice. That might be a meditation practice for 5 minutes or 2 minutes, right? Inhaling and exhaling, saying that to oneself. I'm right here. I'm inhaling and exhaling to presence oneself. That might be different types of calming breath practices. There are cooling breath practices and more energizing. In response to trauma, often what I suggest is more calming or cooling. And this is to respond to the hypervigilance, which can completely hijack the nervous system, right? Like, that is what's happening. And so part of this is to bring the nervous system into a more grounded space, if possible. There's also grounding that people can do physically. Like right now I'm standing and I feel my feet on the ground. Often I invite people to look around the space they're in, and not the quality of the space, but to notice, what are the colors, what are the shapes, what other living beings might be in your space. I have plants in here. My dog is right down here on the ground, right? There's mental grounding that can happen as well through, books on my bookshelf. I'm not looking at the title, but I'm looking at the letters. It's like really orienting to time and space. Where am I right now? To again bring oneself back into the body, into the moment, because that's what gets taken, and again is connected to that alertness or the high alert that can happen in the nervous system, and then cause the mind, right, to move one away from where they actually are, and that they're in a physical body. I also, as I mentioned, was a practicing clinical social worker. So I would say resourcing could be mental health support, could be therapy, could be a support group. And the practices that are more contemplative or mindfulness or movement or the grounding feel like they're adjuncts to that kind of support that one might receive from a support group or from a counselor, or a therapist or a spiritual counselor, whatever people might have access to in community, and where they would like to go, because of course the mental health system has a lot of issues as well, and can be really supportive if someone can find someone who understands them and listens and supports them, and regrounding in their body and their nervous system. And I also think about, I do a lot of work in community, and I mentioned support groups, but I also think about rituals and practices, specifically nature and elemental energy. And I think about the times when I have been in a space, and there are two that are come to heart and spirit right now, of intense PTSD, where the only thing that really, in addition to therapists, supported me and reminded me of the expansiveness of the world was nature. It was like the only thing that would do it. And so for some people it's accessible, like I can go outside, and some people may not be able to do that. And there are other ways to connect with a plant, with an image of an elemental energy on your computer or your phone, if you have that, or engaging in art and connecting with elemental energy. When I would, and even now, but in those moments when I was really I was sort of like, the world makes no sense. I can't piece this together. I can't piece myself together. Going and taking a deep breath outside, or even looking at the sun, which happens to be out in North Carolina where I am right now, would sort of bring me back, and also let me know there is something bigger going on here that's bigger than me, right? The tree is bigger than me, the sun is bigger. And that would like bring me back to myself. Similarly to what physical grounding might do, like I feel my feet on the earth, or I'm noticing the colors in my space, it would just sort of bring me back, but it would be in a bigger space, right? The expanse of the natural world. So that's something else that comes to mind. And working with this elemental energy of, air, fire, water, earth, and the above and the below, if that resonates with people. So there's more about resourcing, but often as I think about the elemental energy, I also think about community and rituals in community to transmute energy, which can also help the nervous system move back into balance.
Yeah. And I think that's also really important for our community. I think a byproduct of this is that when you are sort of like what feels like the sole focus of a person, that it becomes that sort of like framework can be sort of you apply it to yourself as well, where it's really hard to look beyond your own self because of that protective nature, and because you have somebody who is making you the sole focus of their own life. And so I think that, find that, for folks in our community, that finding those moments where they don't want to be only thinking about themselves, where they want to break from that. And I think that, that expansiveness is something that we've heard from a lot of people that has been really helpful to kind of, have a break from that sort of just like feeling of isolation, and focus on the self. And I think, for us too, I don't know if you have sort of feedback or guidance, whether it's, as people look for a support group or a practitioner. I know from my own experience and from a lot of people we've talked to, that there's times I've written off a certain modality or therapy because I thought it didn't work, when in reality I just wasn't with the right person. And then when you find that right person and it connects, it's a totally different experience, or may not be the right form of therapy, whether somebody's in talk therapy and they really need something else to tend more to the body. So I think for us, knowing that, again, it's a really there's so many caveats, it's a really difficult space to navigate, especially asking somebody who's in often crisis to say, oh, we'll just keep searching for the right person, keep searching for the right person, right? There's all these barriers. But yeah, I think as people are looking to that, yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on sort of how people can approach that, or things to look for, kind of red flags when they're working with something, if something just kind of doesn't feel right to them.
Yeah, this is a great point. Thanks for bringing it up. This point of like, I've seen therapists before who I'm like, as you said, this isn't working, but really they weren't the person for me. And I think that's a common experience people have. And I also think in my own experience, especially as a therapist who sought therapy, I can be a terrible client myself. And so just because of having been a therapist, this may not be true for other people. I'm just saying for me, and like there could be resistance or readiness around healing that then may not be a match for the therapist that I was seeking out. So those things can show up. And I would say, most of the time when the therapist it may have taken some time for me to figure out if they're the right fit or not. When they've been the right fit, I know right away. That's what I'll say. And when they haven't been, often there's a feeling in my gut, or like, I don't know if I want to go back, like that kind of feeling, which can come up anyway if we're in pain and suffering and more is being stirred up. So that can happen too. But often my intuition, which of course trauma can disrupt, often my intuition has let me know, like this doesn't feel right, or I don't think they really heard me. And I just want to name that because I want people to listen to that if that's what's coming up, because sometimes, especially in a dynamic where there's a practitioner and a client in quotes, right? There's certainly this hierarchy that can happen that's just present, right? One seeking out a therapist. The therapist says yes or no to working with you. You might be paying the therapist, right? That you might be billing, and all this stuff is going on where they have power in a way that someone who's seeking out therapy or support in that space may not have the same kind of power. And it just sets up a dynamic where I think sometimes people who are seeking out therapy feel like they have to stay with a therapist, and they actually just don't. So if it's not a good fit and there are other resources available, listen to that, because you really want someone who can support you and offer what it is that you might need and be in relationship with you. Like therapy is a collaborative experience in relationship with you, where you can feel seen and heard and supported. And you want to be with a therapist or a practitioner who can support you in your healing. And finally, what I'll say is that I think, as a therapist having been one for a long time, sometimes new people would come in and ask questions. And now, as I'm thinking about your question, I'm thinking about how, if I'm searching for a practitioner who's going to support me in my healing, then I have agency. And I can ask, like, have you worked with people who've experienced this before, and how? Like that specificity, right? Or what if this isn't a good fit? How do I know? Like asking the therapist. I just think I've just experienced clients not asking those kind of questions, and instead sort of waiting so long to receive support that then we're like in this thing that may not actually be of service. And so I want to remind people they have agency as they're seeking out those kind of resources, in the form of asking questions and maybe sitting with, if one can clarify what they might want or need in a therapist, maybe sitting with that question and bringing that in as they're seeking out support.
Yeah. And I often recommend to people, I sort of developed, I call it like a buoy technique, because I know for me, it's really hard to voice something, or to ask questions, or things like that. And so instead of kind of sitting there and suddenly being in my own mind being like, should I bring it up now, or now, or now, or is this appropriate or not, how am I going to handle it, just at the very outset saying, like, it's really hard for me to ask questions or just say how I'm feeling. So I just want to like put that out front, so that when that's coming back, I can then go back to my buoy and say, to come back to this, like, I'm really struggling to articulate this right now, but I don't, and to me that like helps break some of that internal tension that I have. But I think what is so incredible about your work too, and so important, is that, especially I'm based in California, so it's really easy to feel like some of this stuff is like hippy dippy woo woo whatever stuff. And I think again, like the social mediaification of this stuff can really enhance that. But things like saying, trust your gut or take a deep breath, that those aren't just sayings or mantras, although they can be, but how deeply and proven and scientific and real all of that is, and understanding those systems to understand how the impacts are real, the impacts on our body are real, and that these are real things we can do to help alleviate some of what we're experiencing.
That what you just shared is making me think about what many people have said about sort of intuition and listening to oneself and listening to the gut. And I know trauma disrupts these things, a connection to listening. And I feel like part of healing is returning to that space of listening, right? And whatever practices invite people into that. And while I don't want people to be in a sustained state of hypervigilance, it is an indication that something's wrong, not with the person, but something's wrong with what is happening to them. Do you know what I mean? It's like this. I'm just thinking about how, in some ways, for me, that has been liberating to consider. Oh, wait, my nervous system is sending off the alarm. Again, I don't want us to be we can't be in a sustained state of that, but it's doing that because it's trying to protect me, or it knows something needs attention, or it knows something's wrong. And I think that particularly with repetitive patterns of harm and violence, that can be forgotten by the person who's experiencing it, right? They can internalize something's wrong with me, or I wish I just didn't feel this way, right? When it's like, actually your nervous system is doing what it is been trained to do when there's something that's happening that's potentially harmful or is harmful. We just can't stay in that space. And so the practices I named are like, how do I move out of that space so I'm not always in that space? So I just wanted to affirm that for folks, because I know it can, the internalization can make it seem like I'm the one, right? It's me, when in fact, your nervous system's just pointing to like what is imbalanced around you, right? Or what happened to you that maybe caused you to feel out of balance or disrupted. So yeah.
Well, I would love to know if you could walk us through a couple practices, or even if you think that there's if there's rituals that you find that are helpful for people, just to get them to start thinking about what that might look or sound or feel like as they kind of go and seek their own healing journeys on their own and collectively within our community.
Yeah, I'm gonna lead I can lead a short, it will feel like a meditation, but it's a grounding, centering, and then I'll say something related to a practice about resilience as well, which might actually come up in this meditation. So I'm going to close my eyes. With people, you can have your eyes open, of course, and you can decide how you want to be in your body. This really isn't about overthinking, but if you're sitting or seated and you'd like to stand, and you can do that. If you want to sit or lie down or wrap up in something, however you want to be, that's the invitation. And again, my eyes are closed just to lead this. Your eyes can be open or closed, and I'm going to guide us through a few moments of deep breathing, and I'll share more about it. So I'll guide us along the way of coming into the body and of connecting to an experience of calm strength is often what it is called. And so find a way to be. And if it's accessible to you and feels okay, you might bring your shoulders up, move them back and down. They like to live up next to the ears, and that's not actually where they reside. So you can, if possible, allow them to move away from your ears, just making some space for yourself and stretching a bit. And then taking a moment to notice the parts of your body that are touching the earth. So my feet are on the earth. Maybe your seat is on the earth, or your feet are on the earth and your seat is in a chair. Or maybe your feet are supported by something underneath them, bringing the earth to you. And sometimes I even touch the earth to reconnect to that element and source of energy, right, with a hand, but my feet are on the earth. So I feel well supported and know the earth is underneath me right now, supporting me, upholding me, uplifting me. Now, if your eyes are open and it would feel more supportive to scan the space you're in to know where you are, you can. And if you do, I would invite you not to scan the space for the quality of the space, like how much stuff is in it, and oh, I need to clean my desk. That's not what this is. But to scan and just notice colors, shapes. If you have windows in your space, the light that might be coming in. If there's a door and it would be grounding to know where that door is, you might look to that door so you know there's a way for you to move out of the space you're in if you need. And I invite you to bring your awareness to your breath, even as you're scanning, if you are, or as your eyes are closed and you're feeling the earth underneath you. And I recognize breathing and consciously breathing can bring up a lot of different emotions and feelings. And I know that taking a few deep breaths, conscious breaths, sends a signal to the nervous system to ground, to find balance, to calm itself if possible. So that's how we're working with the breath, bringing your awareness to the breath, knowing that bringing our awareness to the breath and beginning to deepen our breath actually works with the nervous system, tends the nervous system, calms the nervous system. So take a few breaths. This is the invitation. And if your mind needs to be a little active, you might say to yourself, breathing in as you inhale, breathing out as you exhale, or inhaling and exhaling with each cycle of breath. And we'll add one more layer to this, which is as you breathe, as you send a signal to the nervous system to move back into balance, which is its natural state, I invite you to bring an image into your awareness that is representative of calm, strength. If you want to substitute balance instead of calm, because the objective is not always to be calm, is to find peace when we can. But the invitation is to bring an image that represents calm strength into your awareness. And this might be a person, it might be a landscape, it might be a song lyric, it might be A furry companion, might be an ancestor, an image of calm strength. And I invite you to breathe and notice everything you can about this image. You might notice color, shapes, texture, sounds. This image might be a place you visited or something more abstract, something you've created from your spirit, your heart, your mind, your knowing, an image of calm strength. And the final piece of this centering is to work with a mantra or a statement. You can work with it in Sanskrit, which is what I'll offer, or you can say the translation. The mantra is so hum. It's so hum, and it means I am that, or thou art that. And the idea is that this image of calm strength emerged from your consciousness, your awareness, your being. And so you are this calm strength. Even when you don't feel like it, you are this calm strength, you embody it. And so if you'd like, you can repeat to yourself, so hum, or I am that, or thou art that, for a few rounds. As you hold this image of calm strength, you might say, so hum, so hum, so hum. You are this calm strength. And taking just a few more breaths here. And when you're ready, you can return and know that you can revisit this mantra, so hum, or I am that, or thou art that, at any point. You can revisit the grounding, feeling the earth underneath you. You can revisit the breath, consciously breathing anytime you might need, just as a way to come back to yourself and your center. And the only other piece I want to share for a moment is the practice, that So Hum practice, relates to what I named earlier about passing on trauma and passing on resilience, or whatever word people want to use, what exists in addition to trauma, right, which is present, what else is present, what else are we passing on, what else is part of our lineage, either blood or otherwise. And I want to remind people of that potential to be creating and passing on or cultivating something other than trauma. And it's likely that's happening alongside our healing from trauma, and actually through the healing, right? That we're tapping into resilience or other things we want to embody. So that calm strength feels connected to that. So thanks for asking me to lead a practice.
Thank you so much. I can't imagine just a better way to go into the weekend, into the new year, into this month. And there's this really cool effect too, as you've been speaking to us today, of the sunlight coming and hitting you more, and just what a beacon you are for this community. And the sun agrees. Um, just in closing, for folks that would be interested in learning more about your work, or where to find it, where's the best place for people to to learn more about that or access those resources?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of this month's events and for being in conversation with me in this way. People can find me on my website, which is Michelle, MICHELLEC, Johnson.com. That's the best place because it's updated with events, and I have a podcast called Finding Refuge and other resources, so people can find me there. And I do offer a lot of online and in-person immersions, trainings, workshops, experiences, and more will be added throughout this year for sure. So lots of things coming up. So people can, and there are also some podcast interviews with me that some very much relate to what we talked about today, if people want to hear more in that way, and that's accessible for them. I'm also on social media, and am most active on Instagram, and my handle there is Skill in Action, which is the name of my first book, Skill in Action. And I post events there, but also more personal things too, and musings and just things I'm thinking about, and nature. And so people can find me there too. There's also a way on my website to reach out, a contact form, if folks want to follow up with me after hearing this conversation or experiencing me in this way. So yeah.
Beautiful. And yeah, we'll be sure to share all of that in the comments as well. But Michelle, thank you again so much for this. And yeah, until next time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the work that you all do. Be well. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.